An Air Canada Airbus A320 cuts through heavy snow on its final approach to Halifax in Nova Scotia. On the surface, all appears to be well, but the pilots have made a fatal error. In the space of a few moments, what began as a routine landing quickly turns into a fight for survival for all 138 passengers and crew. This is the story of Air Canada Flight 624. It was a cold spring evening at Toronto's Pearson Airport in Canada in March of 2015. 133 passengers were boarding an Air Canada Airbus A320 bound for Halifax in Nova Scotia, 2 hours flying time away. Looking after them were 3 cabin crew. The aircraft being used for this flight was 24 years old, making it one of the oldest aircraft in Air Canada's fleet. But despite its age, the plane was in good condition. In the cockpit were 2 experienced pilots. The captain had been with Air Canada for 9 years, amassing almost 12,000 hours total time, about half of which were on the A320. He would be flying the aircraft to Halifax on this evening, while the first officer handled the radios and did the paperwork. Sitting to his right was that first officer. He had been with Air Canada for 15 years, and had been flying the A320 for all of that time. He was almost as experienced as the captain, with 11,300 total hours. However, he had more experience on the A320, with just over 6,000 hours. Both pilots were well rested for the flight and had good safety records. Air Canada is a big airline, and so this was their first time flying together. As the pilots prepared for departure, over in Halifax, weather conditions were not as benign as they were in Toronto. It was windy, snow was blowing, and the visibility was poor, at just over 1 kilometre. The cloud ceiling was 500 feet, meaning that on landing, the pilots wouldn't see the runway until very shortly before touchdown. Owing to these conditions, the pilots needed to have a few alternate airports in mind in case they couldn't make it into Halifax. Their airport of choice was Montreal, about 800 kilometres to the east of Halifax. They would evaluate whether a diversion was necessary later in the flight, as they neared Halifax. Just before 10 o'clock that night, once the aircraft was fueled and everyone was on board, Flight 624 was pushed back from the gate. The cabin crew gave a pre-flight safety briefing to the passengers, and the pilots started their engines. As they taxied out to the runway, the pilots completed their before takeoff checklist. At 5 minutes past 10, the captain lined up with the runway and set takeoff thrust. A few moments later, Flight 624 was in the air and climbing out over Toronto. Before long, the flight was cleared to its cruising level of flight level 350, or about 35,000 feet. As they climbed, the pilots took a look at the latest weather information from Halifax, and they began to formulate a plan. At present, the alternate airport they had chosen was Montreal, over 400 nautical miles away. What this meant was that they would have enough fuel for an approach at Halifax, and then enough for a few minutes of holding before they would have to divert to Montreal. But there was another way they could allocate this fuel. What if, instead of putting aside enough fuel to take them all the way to Montreal, they changed their alternate to the much closer airport of Moncton in New Brunswick? This would give them more time to hold above Halifax, in the hopes that the weather would improve there before they needed to divert. And it looked like this extra time would be needed if they wanted to make it into Halifax. The weather there was marginal. The visibility was below what they needed it to be in order to conduct an approach. So, as they made their way north, the pilots would need to keep an eye on it before beginning an approach. As the pilots monitored the situation, the cabin crew had dimmed the lights to allow the passengers to rest before arrival. There's loads of information that I would love to have included in this video, but that I just couldn't fit in without making the video too long. So if you want to get a deeper understanding of how this accident happened, I've actually made a website with loads of interesting details about it. I made this website using the website app from this video's sponsor, Odoo. Odoo is an all-in-one management software that gives entrepreneurs a range of applications which make it simple to manage their business. Everything from invoicing, accounting, project management, inventory, and, as I'm doing now, website creation is included, among other apps. I know I make a living online, but I still wouldn't consider myself much of an expert when it comes to things like making websites. Even still, I found it really straightforward to set up a website for this episode. You can do it in only 4 steps. Select the type of website, the industry and goal, then choose a color palette, add pages and features, and select a theme. Now that you have the structure, you can customize your website just by dragging and dropping blocks as you see fit, and modifying the layout by changing the images and text. This kind of simple user interface makes it quick and easy to set up a website with Odoo, so you can get the technical parts out of the way and focus on what it is you're trying to get across to your visitors. I've included the link to this site in the video description so you can check it out for yourself. Odoo allows you to create your website for free with their lifetime 1 app free plan, including unlimited hosting and support. You also get a free custom domain for 1 year. The suite of applications means that as your business grows, you can add on more applications as you need them for an affordable subscription. Thanks again to Odoo for sponsoring this video. Now, back to the episode. There were 2 runways at Halifax, runway 3214 and runway 2305. It had snowed so heavily that runway 3214, the shorter of the 2 runways, had to be closed. So, that just left runway 2305. Runway 23 had a full instrument landing system, with radio beams giving both vertical and horizontal guidance down to the runway, something the pilots would really like to have in bad conditions like this. However, the winds were from the north, and they were quite strong, reaching as much as 25 knots or 46 kilometers per hour. This meant that the pilots would need to use the opposite direction runway, runway 05. But this came with a problem. Runway 05 did not have a full instrument landing system. Rather, it just had the lateral element of the ILS, the localizer. What this meant was that the pilots would need to provide their own vertical guidance based on their charts. Here's a copy of the approach chart they would use. The table at the top of this chart, circled in orange, showed the crew what altitude they needed to be at different distances from the runway. So at 12 miles, they needed to be at 3,870 feet, and at 11 miles, they needed to be at 3,540 feet, and so on down until they could see the runway. Obviously, this would be less precise than an approach where this information was coming from a radio beam, rather than from the pilots reading the altitudes off a chart. So to account for this lack of precision, localizer-only approaches have higher minima, the altitude at which the approach must be abandoned if the pilots cannot see the runway. For this localizer-only approach, the pilots would have to go around if they couldn't see the runway by 740 feet above sea level, which here was 277 feet above the airport. Air Canada, like most airlines, added an extra 50 feet to this altitude just to be safe. So, this meant that when the plane was 790 feet above sea level, if the pilots couldn't see the runway, they would have to go around. All of this may seem like minor detail, but it's vitally important in order to understand what happens next. Luckily for the crew of Flight 624, the Airbus has a useful feature which makes approaches like this a lot easier than they were in days gone by. It's possible to use the autopilot to select a particular angle of descent. This mode is called FPA, or Flight Path Angle. The path down to the runway was a 3.08 degree downhill slope. So, all the pilots had to do, when they reached this point here, was to set this window to minus 3.1 degrees and pull the knob. From there, the plane would simply follow a 3.1 degree path down, reaching the runway at the correct point, as long as the pilots made any necessary corrections along the way. But there was a further consideration that the pilots had to make, and to get a deeper appreciation of what they had to contend with on this night, we need to take a look at what it means to fly in cold weather. Planes can tell their altitude based on pressure sensing instruments on the aircraft's skin. These instruments work on the simple principle that the higher you go, the thinner the air is, and therefore the less pressure the air exerts on everything. The relationship between altitude and air pressure is known, so when these instruments are manufactured, they're calibrated in such a way that any pressure they sense corresponds to a certain altitude in the sky. So if they sense a pressure of 700 millibars, this means an altitude of 10,000 feet. If they sense a pressure of 500 millibars, this means an altitude of 18,000 feet, and so on. The lower the pressure, the higher the altitude. This is a straightforward way of telling how high the plane is, and it's still the primary means by which modern passenger jets measure altitude, even after almost a century of use. For air with a normal temperature, this is what the air pressure looks like at different altitudes. At this level of pressure here, 700 millibars, which I've arbitrarily picked, the altimeter reads 10,000 feet. The altimeter is calibrated so that this pressure level, 700 millibars, always gives a reading of 10,000 feet. So, in a normal atmosphere, if you got a measuring tape and stretched it this high in the air, you would see that it did indeed read 10,000 feet. But in very cold air, there is a problem. Cold air is dense air. So, all of this air is now packed into a much smaller space. So now, a pressure reading of 700 millibars no longer actually corresponds to a real altitude of 10,000 feet. What this means is that when the plane thinks it's here, in a mass of very cold air, it's actually here. It's still at the 700 millibar level, but because the air is cold, that pressure now exists at a lower altitude than 10,000 feet. As you can see from our comically long measuring tape, now that the temperature is 20 degrees lower than normal, the 700 millibar level now exists at a true altitude of about 9,200 feet. The plane's altimeters still read 10,000 feet because all they sense is pressure, and they think that 700 millibars always means 10,000 feet. What they don't know is the real or true altitude of the plane, which in this case is 9,200 feet. Even with all of the modern technology in a jet like the A320, there is still no way to account for this difference. So, pilots refer to cold weather correction charts to determine what altitude they need to add for whatever they see on their altimeters. We'll have a look at how this worked on Flight 624 in a moment. It was now almost an hour into the flight, and in the cockpit, the atmosphere was calm. The Air Canada dispatcher passed on the latest weather at Halifax, including the winds, visibility, and runway surface conditions. So far, the conditions were still suitable for landing. However, the dispatcher also told them that another flight approaching Halifax had to go round due to the poor weather. Just in case the same fate befell them, the pilots went through the missed approach procedure for runway 05 and once again reviewed the weather. 15 minutes later, they got some unwelcome news. Heavy snow had now reduced visibility down to 1/4 of a statute mile, below the 1/2 statute mile required to carry out an approach. This wasn't ideal, but at this point, the pilots were happy enough to continue towards Halifax and enter a holding pattern if the weather still hadn't improved by the time they'd arrived. Once established in the hold, they would wait, hoping for a gap to open up in the bad weather. If it didn't, they could simply divert to one of their alternates, where the weather was better. In the passenger cabin, the flight continued as normal, with the cabin crew putting the drink carts away and collecting rubbish. At 20 minutes past 11 that night, Flight 624 was cleared down to 29,000 feet. The pilots then conducted an approach briefing for runway 05. As part of this brief, they included the cold weather corrections which we discussed earlier. Here's the chart that the pilots were using on this night. The pilots would fly along at 2,000 feet plus 200 feet to account for the cold air. Then, once they got to the Split Crow radio beacon, 4.6 nautical miles from the runway, they would engage the FPA, or Flight Path Angle mode of the autopilot, and start the plane down. The charts said that the vertical angle needed would be 3.08 degrees down. but the pilots had calculated that with an outside temperature of -5 degrees Celsius, or 23 degrees Fahrenheit, this angle would need to be 3.5 degrees. So, it would be that angle which they would need to dial into the window here. If the pilots didn't see the runway by the minimum descent altitude, they would go around. The minimum descent altitude for this approach was 740 feet, plus 23 feet for the cold weather, plus another 50 feet as per Air Canada's procedure. So, if the pilots didn't see the runway by an indicated altitude of 813 feet, they would go around. This was the plan which they briefed as they began their descent towards Halifax. A few minutes later, when the pilots made contact with the terminal controller, they learned that the weather at Halifax was still not suitable for an approach. So they told the controller they would need to enter a holding pattern to the west of the airport. The controller cleared them to descend to 9,000 feet and to enter the hold as requested. The captain pointed out to the first officer that if they had to, they could stay in the hold until 1 a.m, which was an hour and 35 minutes from now. However, if they waited that long, then Halifax would be their only option, so it was likely that they would divert before that point. At about 20 minutes to midnight, Flight 624 entered a holding pattern to the west of the airport. While in the hold, the pilots began their in-range checks in preparation for landing. These included turning the landing lights on. In thick cloud and snow, the bright landing lights can actually make the runway lights harder to see. So the captain said that he might want these lights turned off again as they neared the runway. If the weather did improve enough for them to make an approach, it would be by so little that they would need every bit of help they could get to see the runway. The cabin crew made an announcement to the passengers, telling them to put away their carry-on luggage, fasten their seatbelts, and return their seats to the upright position for landing. The cabin crew then took their seats in preparation for landing, whenever that would be. Round and round they went in a racetrack pattern, hoping that a gap would open up in the weather. After 25 minutes in the hold, there was still no sign of improvement. The captain told the first officer that if the weather didn't improve in the next 20 minutes, they would be diverting to Moncton. 5 minutes later, the controller informed the pilots that Halifax's latest weather showed winds from the north at 20 knots, gusting to 25 knots, visibility 1/8 of a statute mile, in heavy and drifting snow. It was looking increasingly unlikely that the 138 passengers and crew would be getting into Halifax on this night. But then, a few minutes later, some good news. The visibility had risen to half a mile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make an attempt at landing. The captain left the hold, and the controller cleared him to fly to a waypoint called Odcas on the extended runway centerline, and to descend to an altitude of 4,000 feet. Finally, things were coming together for the flight. Now, it began to be time to think about what sight would greet them, or not, as they neared the runway. To give himself the best chance of seeing the runway lights through the snow, the captain turned off the landing lights. He then asked the controller if the runway lights were turned up to their highest setting. The controller said that they weren't at that moment, but that they would be by the time the pilots needed them. Within a few minutes, Flight 624 had levelled off at 3,400 feet. It was now just 12 nautical miles from the runway. The localizer mode of the autopilot was armed, meaning that when the plane's receivers picked up the signal from the localizer, it would begin turning towards the runway. For these kinds of approaches, the procedure is to have the aircraft fully configured by the time it reaches the final approach fix. In this case, that fix was the Spit Crow radio beacon, 4.6 miles from the runway. To be fully configured means to have the gear down and the flaps at the setting that they will be at for landing. This way, when the aircraft is descending towards the runway, it's aerodynamically stable and the pilots can focus on monitoring its descent without it being disturbed by the extension of gear or flaps. So, to prepare the plane for its descent, the pilots extended the flaps to the first position. Shortly after this, the plane captured the localizer beam and began turning towards the runway. They were now just 11 miles from the airport. The first officer extended the flaps further, to the second notch, as the airspeed decreased. Directly beneath them, the pilots could make out some lights on the ground, but ahead of them was nothing but blackness. At a distance of 8 nautical miles from the runway, the captain called for the landing gear to be lowered. The snowplows that had been clearing the runway were now told to vacate it, in preparation for Flight 624's landing. The aircraft now levelled off at 2,200 feet, and as it continued decelerating, the captain called for the final 2 stages of flaps. Just after passing 7 miles from the runway threshold, Flight 624 was fully configured for landing. The gear was down, and the flaps were set. The pilots had correctly added 200 feet to the altitude on the chart, and now they would simply wait until they were close to the final approach fix, split crow, before they started down. In preparation for this, the captain selected the flight path angle mode of the autopilot. He then dialed in a descent angle of 3.5 degrees and waited. Second by second, the plane drew closer to the split crow beacon. Just before he reached it, still 0.3 of a nautical mile away, the captain would pull this knob here, and the plane would follow his direction to descend at an angle of 3.5 degrees. The reason he wasn't going to wait until he was directly over the beacon to do this is that if he did, the plane would only begin to descend then, and would only reach the desired angle after it had already passed the descent point. Instead, by pulling the knob a third of a nautical mile before reaching it, the plane would reach a descent angle of minus 3.5 degrees around the point that it intercepted the ideal glide path. So, at 27 minutes past midnight, that's exactly what the captain did, applying the correct technique and starting the plane down towards the runway. At this point, the pilots were watching their instruments closely. There was still nothing to see out the window, as snow and dense cloud obscured the runway lights from view. If they didn't see the approach lights by the time their altimeters read 813 feet, they would go round. With no ground-based guidance telling the pilots whether they were too high or too low, as would have been the case if they had had a glide slope indication from a full ILS, the pilots would need to rely on other means to determine whether they were on the correct vertical profile. Luckily for them, their charts detailed exactly what altitude they needed to be at different distances from the runway. All they had to do was check what altitude the chart said they needed to be at for each given distance, and then, as they passed that distance indicated on their displays, check whether their altimeters said the same thing, adjusted of course for the cold weather. Airbus, recognizing the importance of altitude awareness on approaches like this, had described in their manuals the need for pilots to check these altitudes as they passed them, and make adjustments to the flight path if they found themselves high or low. The rule of thumb is that for every 10 feet you're off, you should adjust the descent angle by 0.1 of a degree, and then reassess at the next height check. So, if the captain found at one of the height checks that he was 20 feet low, he should shallow his descent from 3.5 degrees to 3.3 degrees, and so on until he got back on profile. However, this is where a latent problem in Air Canada's procedures started to rear its head. Contrary to Airbus's flight crew operating manual, Air Canada did not require its pilots to check their heights during these approaches, once they were past the final approach fix. All they had to do was set the descent angle and forget about it until they had reached their minima, in this case 813 feet. This would be fine if pilots were infallible and if winds didn't shift. But in a world of fallible pilots and shifting winds, it's always a good idea to check that the plane is behaving as expected. And on this night, on board Flight 624, if the pilots had checked their altitude against the charts at any point during the approach, they would have seen a consistent pattern. They were low. In fact, as each second passed, they got lower and lower below the profile. Before long, they were more than 100 feet lower than they were supposed to be. The reason for this is that the flight path angle mode of the autopilot cannot compensate perfectly for changes in the wind as the plane descends. So, while it is generally very accurate, it does require monitoring. But the pilots had not been trained to monitor it. So, they remained blissfully ignorant of the true state of the aircraft's flight path as it descended further. Once the snowplows had cleared the runway, the tower controller cleared Flight 624 to land. But one thing the controller had neglected to do was to turn up the lights from their current setting of 4 to the maximum intensity setting of 5. This might seem like a small difference, 4 versus 5, but setting 5 was 4 times brighter than setting 4. In a few moments, this seemingly small oversight would have serious consequences. As the aircraft descended through 400 feet above ground level, its automated voice called out 400. Almost immediately after this, the plane descended through its minimum altitude of 813 feet above sea level. The first officer could just about see some approach lights out his windscreen, and he made the standard call out of minimum lights only. The captain responded, landing. At this point, the plane was 0.3 of a nautical mile back from where it should have been. The pilots had seen the approach lights, and so they were within their rights to continue the approach. However, at this point, as per Air Canada's procedures and Airbus's, the captain should have disconnected the autopilot and continued the approach manually. But he didn't do this. Instead, he continued to let the autopilot bring the aircraft down for more than 20 seconds. At night, and certainly on a cloudy, snowy night like this one, pilots have very few cues available to them to judge whether they are high or low. The ground around them isn't visible, and on this night, the PAPI lights, which give a colour-coded indication of whether the plane is on the correct descent profile, weren't visible from the cockpit. The pilots could only see the very start of the runway, and so couldn't use its appearance to tell whether they were high or low, like they would normally. What's more, the fact that on this night, the approach lights were not as bright as they should have been, gave the impression to the pilots that they were further away from the runway than they in fact were. This led them to think that they had more time to judge the aircraft's position relative to the runway than they in fact had. In a few short moments, all of these factors would come together, much to the surprise of the flight crew. Shortly before the aircraft reached a height of 100 feet, the captain turned on the landing lights and disconnected the autopilot. Within seconds, it became clear that the plane was well below where it needed to be. The first officer called out, "Pull up,"
30.
and the captain did, pulling his side stick fully aft and slamming the thrust levers to their maximum setting. But it was too late. The plane ripped through the power line which supplied the airport terminal, causing an immediate blackout there, and then it slammed into the ground tail first. Each main landing gear strut was ripped off and impacted the horizontal stabilizer, breaking off part of it. The aircraft bounced and continued forwards, with the nose gear collapsing as it hit the runway, and the left engine separating entirely from the aircraft. The plane skidded along the runway for a few hundred meters before finally coming to a stop. Incredibly, everyone on board had survived. Of the 138 people on board, 25 were injured, including both pilots. 2 people received serious injuries. The question on everyone's minds was why this had happened in the first place, and then what could be done to prevent an accident like this from ever happening again. As a result of this accident, Air Canada changed its procedures so that now pilots must continue to monitor where the aircraft is vertically throughout non-precision approaches, and not just before the final approach fix. The airline also provided pilots with clearer guidance on the limitations of the FPA mode of the autopilot, clarifying that it just selects an angle in space, and that the aircraft can still drift above or below the selected angle. For its part, Halifax Airport upgraded its approach lighting system, making it easier for pilots to judge their height and distance from the runway in poor weather. This accident shows how thin the margin for error can be in poor conditions, especially when an airport's infrastructure is limited and when an airline's procedures aren't up to the task. Progressive changes like the ones that resulted from this crash have made flying safer not just in Canada, but in the rest of the world as well. In the case of Air Canada 624, it's just fortunate that these lessons were learned without any loss of life.